All right, we're here. It's 6 p.m. Good evening, everybody, and welcome.
Good evening.
Yes, good evening. That's you've just reminded me. Could you all please turn your microphones off, and could you please turn off your cameras? We are recording, and this will be made public. This webinar. It'll travel around the world. So if you can please turn everything off. And don't be tempted to scribble on your screens either. So if you do see little gadgets in your screen with here on Zoom, please do not play around with them, because we get people just actually scribbling all over the place on these amazing PowerPoints. So you can do that anytime, but after this, okay? All right. So we're going to be turning off our audio. So your microphone and your video, please, except for Professor Biase. So again, everybody, welcome. And could I just briefly introduce Professor Bruno Biase, who is no stranger to community languages here in New South Wales, and he'll be able to speak to you about that a bit later. He actually published, if I can just show you, Community Languages Matters. All right, this is the first research project that the Federation was involved in. With the University of Western Sydney, and Professor Biase and his colleagues researched your sector, the community languages sector here in New South Wales. Back, if I'm not mistaken, in 2008 this was published. And this was generously, we got assistance through the Community Languages Schools program. And of course, I have to mention that the Community Languages Schools program of the New South Wales Department of Education also funded these webinars as well. So our acknowledgement goes to the program as well. Now, Professor Biase is an adjunct associate professor in the School of Humanities and Communication Arts at Western Sydney University. His research interest is primarily in second language acquisition, focusing on grammatical development, with a strong interest in language learning and its relationship to language teaching, as well as bilingualism and language maintenance. Professor Biase is involved in language documentation in multilingual communities such as ours, and the development of digital resources for language learning. He has published and edited several research books and over 60 articles, many in collaboration with other scholars. He supervises higher degree research students, and over the last 4 decades he has taught Italian and linguistics, and has collaborated with the great Manfred Pieneman at the Language Acquisition Centre, University of Sydney, and with Joseph Lobianco at the NLLIA, the National Languages and Literacy Institute of Australia, on national language profiles back in the 90s. He's also been a NATI examiner and a film subtitler with SBS. That's enough from me. I'd like to welcome Bruno Biase, and please reserve your questions until later. Keep your cameras off. I can still see some of you with your cameras on. Switch everything off, please, and let's enjoy this session. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. And hello and welcome to everyone who is connected with us. I hope this will be of some use to you. I guess most of you are community language teachers. Am I okay? Can you hear me, Alex? Hello?
All good, all good.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's good. Fine, I wasn't that sure. All right, so let's start straight away with this. What are we going to do in the next 40 minutes or so? Then there will be questions. So we first look at the neglected role of linguistic environment in language learning, whether it is first, second, or heritage languages. So heritage languages are the languages that we are mainly focusing on tonight. They are the languages of the children of migrants. Then we will discuss and exemplify some ideas for promoting lexical and grammatical development in instructional setting. That's what you do, you teach language. And we look at what we have called, in a rather more academic fashion, developmentally moderated focus on form. And we will explain that later. Then we will also discuss the important role of the family and carers of the children you teach, and how to encourage them to help you in your language maintenance and development work, because I guess this is what your goal is to try to maintain the language of the children, the language of the family. For the dominant language in Australia, so that's English, I really believe that the family should not worry over much about it. And neither the teachers of community languages, of course, because they are teaching the community language indeed. The environment will look after them, so you don't have to worry. Concentrate on the language which is likely to be the weaker language of the child. Of course, in these days where many things matter, the mattering has become a rather political issue as well. We also say that community languages matter. Alex just showed you a report we did in 2008. They matter to whom? Well, they matter to the child. So why? Well, to communicate with the family at home and abroad, for a healthy identity, for a healthy brain, because speaking two languages constantly or continuously, it will also help you delay mental deterioration. So it is good for health, and also to give the child opportunities for later in life. For second language learner, also to communicate across different cultures, to have fun and healthy activity, and opportunities, more opportunities in life than if they are just monolingual. For the family, it matters. For the family and for the immediate community as well. Because having this language will ensure communication across generations and between communities, maintain and enrich culture. So we are in a different culture from the one we come from. I come from Italy myself, and I can say that being here and being in contact with so many other cultures has certainly enriched me no end. Now, and also it matters for the wider society to prevent breakdowns in communication, enrich the culture and the sustainability of the culture and the languages, generate, and the society, of course, generate opportunities for trade and cultural and knowledge exchange internationally. So for all these reasons, and most likely many more, community languages matter. Okay, now I'll take this off here. So languages characterize the human environment. Any human environment is characterized by language. So the one common thing to all human environment is communication through language. Humans have evolved sophisticated communication system, and there are more than 7,000 languages spoken on the globe. most humans use more than one language to communicate with relatives, neighbors, and across groups and countries. So monolingualism is actually a minority situation these days, and probably always so. The environments in which we learn a language can be quite different. One is naturalistic environment. Another one is the instructed environment classroom. So when you learn a second language in a class, and instruction in L2 can also occur where the dominant environmental language is the same L2. So we are talking about L1, L2. The L1 is the language you learn as a child. L2 is the language you learn after the L1. We also have bilingual, simultaneous bilingualism, which means that you learn the languages at the same time. And you have a number of situations where the environment may be the dominant language in the environment may be the same as your strong language, or it may be the same as your weak language. Now, you note that natural and formal learning are not contradictory, but complementary. Okay, so often these two things are put in contradiction, but they're actually complementary. You can learn also both in the home, as you know, in the home, in the classroom, and outside in the community and society. Most research in childhood bilingualism had been based on a one-parent, one-language situation in Western nuclear families. But many other acquisition environments can nurture bilingualism. So for instance, the Asian extended families in Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong. And then you also have one parent, two languages, like in the case of immigrant families in Australia, as we have been saying so far. So one environment and one language, context bound. So that the learning of the language is bound to context, the context in which you are, and the linguistic context particularly in which you find yourself. And that's the way mostly you learn, is by linking the language to the context. Now, all of those input conditions, so there are different input conditions that we have seen just in the previous slides. They all have chances to succeed. There isn't one that is particularly better or worse than another. And we have at Western Sydney, my university, we have a bilingualism research lab that looks mainly at context-bound, one environment and one language. That is the situation of migration. So we continue research in that type of input condition. Now, there are, of course, concerns by parents. We often have parents voicing their worries about particularly two things. One is that one of the languages is going to be weaker. So one language becomes dominant and the other one becomes weaker. And the other problem, worry, is transfer. The children may get confused and mix their languages, so that where they use some structure of one language while speaking the other language. Now, the weaker language, it will always be the case that one language will be weaker than another. I mean, I can tell, like from my own personal experience, for instance, when I go to Italy, after a while, Italian becomes stronger than my English. But at the beginning, people would say, "Ooh, you speak Italian very well." So, meaning that I don't sound at all like an Italian. And I'm sure that a lot of Australian English speakers would not judge me as a native speaker of Australian either. So I'm somewhere in the middle. But as soon as I get back to Australia, after a little while, English becomes stronger, it's more dominant because I use it most of the time. Okay, so I don't think there is too much to worry about language dominance, but in any case, that has been one of the reasons given for transfer as well, that there is a mixing of languages from the weaker language, from the stronger language into the weaker language. Now, let's look at this issue of transfer. And so we zoom in on a specific particular type of structure, which is the content questions. They're also called WH questions: what, where, when, and so on. Now, what is the situation worldwide for that, for the various languages? So, in a sample of 902 languages, Dreyer found that they exhibit three positional patterns. So even though we said there are 7,000 languages, but if you go and look at all of them, the likely thing that you will find one of these three patterns for WH questions. So, right. One pattern is that the interrogative phrase is obligatorily in initial position. So you say what first. Then there is the WH in situ languages, in which the interrogative phrase is not obligatorily in initial position. So, and there we have languages like Cantonese or Japanese, Korean, and so on. Actually, that group is the biggest group of languages. It's 68% out of this sample of 900 languages have this particular pattern, which is not like English. And then there is a very small number of languages that have a mixed pattern. So in the sense that some interrogative phrases are initial and some are not. And these are languages like Indonesian, but there aren't that many of those, Malay as well. Okay. So what happens with this? Sorry about this. I cannot see, excuse me. Okay. Okay, in the study of Cantonese English bilingual children in Hong Kong, Yip and Matthews documented a number of areas which demonstrate the cross-linguistic influence, so this kind of transfer in early grammatical development. Okay, the direction of systemic, so when we talk about transfer, we don't mean just occasional slips of the tongue or occasional problems of performance, but we talk about actually systematic, so common, usual patterns. So they're not occasional. And that the transfer happened primarily from Cantonese, which is dominant in Hong Kong, towards the weaker language, which was English at the time. They looked at bilingual Cantonese English children. And so they found that, as well as other areas, this was not the only area where there seemed to be transfer. There was the so-called WH movement of the in situ question word in English. I mean, this is it sounds like terrible, but all it is that the question word, like the WH word, is actually, it is not moved to the front, but it is in the same place as in the statement. So you can say, daddy is where, that, just to give you an example, daddy is where. In English, you would say, where is daddy? In English in Hong Kong, you might find this kind of question. So this is what we mean by transfer. Other studies also found similar transfer for environmentally dominant language toward the weaker language. So I'm listing here 3 cases of studies where they found transfer. One of them is the one I just said about Hong Kong. Another one was an Indonesian study in Indonesian where a child was Indonesian Italian, and Indonesian was the stronger language and Italian the weaker language. And then also another study in France where it was French and Dutch. But also there were a number of other cases where there was no transfer. And I won't go through them, but just to show you that we've done this particular work to look at all the studies of bilingual that looked at transfer of the question words. And the explanations offered have always been of a kind of structural type. So one of them is language dominance, so as we said, so that the child, whichever language was dominant in the child. And then other things like that the structures of the 2 languages overlap, or they are one language offers greater complexity than the other. And the other reason given is isomorphism, which means essentially that the basic structure of a language is of the 2 languages is the same, or it's not the same. So, for instance, in even though Chinese and English are very, very different in many ways, but they do share what is called the basic word order, which is subject, verb, and object. Now, not all languages are like that, but many are. And so when that happens, so that the basic pattern is the same, then there is more chance that the transfer will happen. However, as you saw in the slide before, there are all these other cases where there is no, or transfer was not apparent. Okay. So some of these cases have a clear reason. One of them, there is it was a cross-sectional study where they studied younger children and older children. In the younger children, there was transfer, and the older children, there wasn't. So this was the French study, French and Dutch study. So that was rather puzzling, but in this case, you can say, well, but it's quite clear that age has something to do with this, because the younger kids, less than 6-year-old, were transferring while the older one didn't. So there's a clear effect of age. So this, in a way, is telling us also that with age, those transfer patterns may change. Then there are other cases where there is no isomorphism. We said just before that isomorphism means same basic structure in the two languages. Okay, so where there is no isomorphism, there is no transfer. Okay, so Japanese and English, for instance, have got different basic structure. So English is SVO, and Korean and English are SOV. So subject, object, verb for Korean, and subject, verb, and object for English. So in that case, also there is no transfer. And then it is explained by the fact that the two languages have got different basic patterns. However, there is one case where isomorphism happens. So the two languages have the same pattern. So that's Chinese and Mandarin. There is also dominance. So Mandarin is the dominant language of the child, and the issue of overlap and complexity are also there. So, but there is no transfer. So what is the missing piece in the puzzle? The missing piece of the puzzle is the role of the linguistic environment, because every other factor was there. So there was no explanation for why there was no transfer in this particular case. So if the environments are separated and of equal status in terms of strength of input, so remember, input is probably the most important factor for language learning. So if there is equal status in terms of strength of the input, children learn structural rules of different languages quite independently and associate them strongly to different social settings. So you learn one language in one particular setting, and then you learn the other language in the other setting, so long as, for instance, one setting can be the home where you are learning Mandarin or Cantonese, and the other setting can be the extra domestic environment. So outside of the home, you have the community, you have the general society that speaks a different language. And so you learn Mandarin associated with the home and all your relatives and maybe also your community. If you live in a suburb where there are other Cantonese or Mandarin speakers. And you learn English, on the other hand, in the extra domestic, so outside of the home environment. In that case, if the input is roughly balanced, then the child will simply learn both languages without great problems. The rules for language use are not separated from the environmental context. So the strength of association of a grammatical rule with the context outweighs any possibility of interference. So we call that independent, socially situated indexing. That doesn't really matter what we call it. I mean, I guess the concept is fairly clear. You got to have a strength of association of the language with some particular environment and context. And you need to have input. This looks terrible, but it is simply a summary of all the studies we looked at and what happens in the end, where there is no transfer. I talked about those cases. I won't bore you with that. The one case where the puzzle was solved, that is where the idea that the environment is so important came from a case study involving these children. Actually, the case study only looked at one of them. This is a table that shows you just the input patterns of for one of these children. Okay, and you can see mother, father, auntie, grandmother, and so on. All of these are the carers that are giving, are interacting with the child at home. And then later with the child care center, you get teachers and peers where the English input becomes much bigger than the Mandarin input. Okay, but you still have the input at home that keeps counterbalancing. In this particular case, there was no transfer. The robust input from the extra-domestic environment, which we call L epsilon, balances out the dominance of the intra-home environment, providing two structural templates, which the child keeps distinct in their acquisition. So the language epsilon is the language which is the official or majority language predominantly used in the bilingual child extra-domestic environment, in this case, English, because the child was growing up in Sydney. This is a graph that shows the English, or the weaker language. The bottom curve is English and the top curve is Mandarin. The child was followed from the age of 1 to the age of 4, 5, so 4 years and 5 months. So 1 to 7 months to 4 years, 5 months. And this is the curve. Okay, so the English was the weaker language, at least up to this age. We could expect that after this age, English would have continued to grow and probably gone past Mandarin because the input got bigger in English and Mandarin lower. Okay, so we looked then at all the data that was available from that study. And we found that the questions in Mandarin emerged at 2 years and 6 months. In English, the same type of question emerged almost 1 year and a little, 1 year exactly later, 1 year later, at 3 years and 6 months. The in situ questions, so like that is where, were acquired at 2 years and 7 months. In English, no in situ question was found in all the data. So this type of question was only learned for Mandarin because Mandarin has got that kind of question. Are there in situ questions in English? Yes, but they're extremely, extremely rare. So when you, for instance, you are really surprised that somebody bought an elephant, then you say, my God, you know, you bought what? Say, Mommy, I bought an elephant. You bought what? Okay, but this is very rare. It's a rather highly occasional sort of pattern to be used in English. And in fact, most children, from what other researchers also say, they don't use that kind of pattern. Of course, they would understand in the context if it did happen. So in Mandarin, questions that target lie from the beginning, and in English, they follow a similar developmental path as the monolingual English. So just notice, I'm talking here about developmental path, okay? We'll have a little more to say later about that. So these are some more data about the method. Some of the questions that we looked at, and these are the Chinese ones. These are the English ones. And we start from the bottom here, not one. So where we only have one word or two. And then we proceed right up to a level 6. So where is that going? Okay, where we have a rather different pattern from what could happen in Mandarin. Okay, so the child in the end had no problems and continued his development much the same way as English native speaker. What we can say though is that the development was a tiny bit slower, and this is quite common in bilinguals or multilingual. In multilingual learning, that the rate of development is a little bit slower, and this causes a lot of worries from parents who start believing that the child might have some sort of issue with speech, and they might take them to speech. Might take them to fix up their speech by doctors or whoever. But in fact, you just have to be a little patient, because in multilingual development, as I said, development is a little bit slower. You can see here, right? So there are two languages. One develops a bit faster than the other one. But eventually, both of them are similar to the native speaker. Okay, just notice a little bit the development, okay? So that there is a kind of vertical development in different stages, okay? Yeah, so you can see on the column on the right hand, you can see the age at which each of these type of question happened. Okay. So to conclude on this side, on this part, in James' case then, contrary to expectation, that is dominant language, structural, complexity, isomorphic nature of Mandarin and English. Well, transfer of in situ patterns did not occur. The environmentally predominant language, English, exerts a strong counterbalancing influence to transfer in support of the weaker language. So parents should not worry about using their own language at home. The developmental variables, we know that from various studies, and this is only one of them, that eventually with age, certain problems, so certain patterns disappear. For instance, so Soriente's informant, who was the Indonesian Italian, also rich, mature Italian WH initial construction. When he moved to Italy, and the environmental language was Italian. So grandmother didn't understand him when he asked, daddy is where? And so grandmother eventually showed how to ask questions simply by responding. I mean, this is where you don't need to teach the syntax or the grammar, but just simply use the language in context. Okay, so where transfer appears, it will be at most a temporary phenomenon, which can be overcome when it is given environmental support in the course of development. Then, if the separate environments are afforded equal status in terms of strength of input, children can learn structural templates of different languages quite independently and in strong association to different interlocutors and different social settings. So transfer is unlikely to occur under such condition, or if it does, it won't last long. In a supporting language epsilon environment, the weaker language will develop like that of their monolingual peers. Okay, so this is for some of the worries that parents or even teachers may have about bilingual development. Okay, now how about community languages? Children, the children you teach, in what way are they different from both native speakers and second language learners? So heritage language acquisition is a type of early bilingual acquisition that takes place in a specific sociolinguistic environment, such as migration. It is a minority language acquired as a first language, either by itself, for instance, at home, or simultaneously with the majority language. So these are the kids you are teaching mainly. All right, so the community language within the society, being a minority language, is usually not supported by the mainstream school. Indeed, this is where the community language schools come in, or other institutional contexts outside the home and the community sharing that language. Okay, so that's why the community language school come in and have a very important role. Consequently, the children often become far more fluent and proficient in the majority language because, of course, they get most of the input in the majority language. So they become fluent and proficient in that language, while the home language or the community language may become weaker. The general community then does not provide the range of environment and context to ensure a full development of the minority language or a second language learned at school. I mean, you can tell the same or similar situation would happen, say, if a secondary student studies French in a secondary school. Well, I mean, apart from those hours that are devoted to French at school, there is very little other support outside for that language, right? So obviously it's not going to develop a lot because there is not enough input. So the question of input is quite important. So this is where the families and the community's role becomes ever more important if we want to maintain the language. Okay, so you had a previous webinar with Stephen Krashen where he made some important points. He said that we are born to learn languages, so this ability continues through life, although final result may not be uniform. They're not the same from one learner to another. Then also that we learn non-consciously, so acquisition is different from learning from instruction. Then that development of the second language is gradual and goes through obligatory steps that cannot be skipped. That is, there is a natural order. Well, this is as much true for second language as it is for the first language. Okay, and then he said that originally he told teachers to teach according to this natural order. But then he thought that this was a great mistake and said that you can't teach grammar, just concentrate on communication and storytelling and so on. Well, I mean, if we go back to a little bit of history of how this controversy developed and what we understand in language acquisition. So already back in 67, one of the researchers, one of the better known researchers called remarking on the significance of learner's error, encouraged teachers to follow natural development rather than go against it. Okay, so say like teach according to what is natural in development. Okay, so I don't have time to explain much more about that, but just take it that there is such a thing, that there is that is natural development, and that you cannot skip from an earlier thing to a later thing and hope that the learner will learn it. It just won't happen. So then Dulé and Bert later said, okay, we should leave the learning of syntax to the children and redirect our teaching efforts. So you don't bother teaching syntax, okay? And that is, of course, quite true. I mean, so Krashen says, all right, well, then concentrate on meaning and communication, okay? So, in fact, from about that period, the teaching of grammar, especially in language teaching, was looked down on. And certainly for the earlier teaching of children, it would make very little sense to talk about grammar or to try and teach them grammar. I mean, you teach grammar to people who want to become linguists, but not all children need to become linguists. But of course, grammar and language, they are different things. Do you need, this is my question now, do you need to teach grammar for learners to learn to speak grammatically? Of course not. I mean, we know that children grow up speaking eventually grammatically just as much as any other native speaker. So it is not the teaching of the grammar in itself that will help. That is, you don't need to, but you can teach language. So remember, language is learned in context and within a supportive environment. So you use communicative tasks, such as this one here, spot the differences. This task can be used to teach certain things, like questions, for instance. You may be familiar with this type of task or not, but basically you have you encourage two children to talk to each other about the picture they have, which will be slightly different from one from the other. So picture A and picture B. The example, this is only one example of task, communicative task. So with this task, you can attempt to get question sentences, and you can look at the progressive aspect, like the girl is walking the dog, or the man is sitting on the bench, or is reading the newspaper, and so on. There will be differences between the two pictures, and the task for the two participants would be to find, just by talking to each other, because they don't see each other's picture. I mean, by talking to each other, they can find out what the differences are. Okay, this is a rather simple one, but it can be used for very, very early learning. Okay. Okay, so things didn't quite stop, of course, in Krashen's time when he was doing research. I mean, he's still doing research, but mainly on pedagogy rather than acquisition. But things have gone on, and so in '84, you have the teachability hypothesis with Pineman, who tried to see whether learners could, in fact, skip stages through instruction. And of course, he found that the learner do not. Then there is somebody else, long, very famous researcher also, who unhappy with purely communicative teaching that didn't seem to get certain results. He said, okay, we should not focus on forms, so the grammar, but focus on form. And he meant just this one particular form that happens or that comes up at the time when communication breaks down, then just focus on that and just give the learner something more specific. So just focus on that particular form, but otherwise just continue in your meaning-based language teaching. Okay. Then various people, Pinema, myself, Kawaguchi, and others at Clark, that's the Language Acquisition Research Center, in the 90s, when there used to be more interest from the Australian government and a little bit more funding for language and language research. There was more research going on about other languages because as you might remember, some of what Krashen said was based on English as a second language. But of course, not every language behaves like English, indeed. As we saw with the WH question, most languages behave differently from English. Okay, so you need to understand or learn about the particular paths of different languages in order to be able to intervene in teaching. Okay, so where continues to date, we already have developmental sequences of about 20 languages. Where continues today at the Bilingualism Research Center at WSU, but I'm sure that there is plenty more going on around the world as well. On second language acquisition and pedagogy, together with colleagues such as Atomic language maintenance, as well as second language acquisition. So we are also currently implementing projects on developmentally moderated focus on form instruction for teaching English in Malaysia and Indonesia. So this was based on some research I did in 2008 I was looking at Italian learned in Australian school in Sydney. And we did find some of the limitations of this meaning-based instruction insofar that even after 2 or 3 years, children were still at the first stage of development, which is that of learning, being able to learn a word and another word and one more word and so on. So basically you have a reasonable lexical, so the vocabulary development, but not word together in a phrase, or word together in a sentence and so on. So we are then developing this particular style of, it's not a teaching method as such. There are more indication on how to do things. The explanation of this might require a bit more time, but which we don't have right now. But I think the idea is that you teach according to the stage of development of the child, of the learner. So if you know what the developmental point is, where the learner is at, then you construct a program on top of that. Okay, so that in a nutshell. So first find out what the learner knows at what point of development they might be in the natural developmental path. Remember, however, that they're all different, so you need to know individually where they're at. So you know from your own experience that goodness me, we are running out of time. That learners within the same class, even though they get the same instruction from you, but not all of them get exactly the same thing. Some of them get it, some of them don't, and some of them half get it. Then you tailor a developmentally moderated program which uses meaning and communicative tasks-based communicative tasks, keeping development in mind and focusing only on what the learner is developmentally ready to acquire, and then assess continuously the results and make the necessary adjustment to your teaching program. Okay, after this, I had some more things for you, some programs that had were done in the 90s, and that might still be very useful. This one is about reading. I will just simply leave it in the slides, which I will pass on to Alex, and then you can have access to that as well, and just have a look at the slides in your own time, and also have a look at these. They are on YouTube anyway, so that you can look at them when you can. All right, I think, Alex, we will leave things here, and if there is any time for questions, I'm happy to respond.
Sure. Thank you, Bruno. If anyone does have any questions, that was very, very interesting. Please feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, what we will do, with your permission, we have recorded this, as I did mention at the beginning, and we will make this available for further reference for those who couldn't make it, or for those of you who don't want to go over this again. And it will be made available on the Federation's YouTube channel. And don't forget the Google Classrooms. Just email me. You've got the email through your Eventbrite. But apart from that, so thank you so much, Professor Biase. That was very, very interesting. There's a lot more that we need to understand about language learning, language acquisition, the role of the environment, because we haven't actually spoken about this before. We haven't had too much instruction regarding the linguistic environment, and I find that this is something that we did need to explore. So that was great. Just before we do end, and we'll let you all get back to your evening, but just mention that next week we have another session. It's more to do with the K-10 syllabus. You've got information about that. But I just wanted to also mention that for those of you who do want to continue with these masterclasses, what the Federation is also offering is a series of a course actually, of 7 meetings. They're 1.5 hours long. We will give you more information about that. And this is conducted through the Multilingualism Research Center of Macquarie University. So that we will talk about at another time. Professor Biase, that was excellent. Thank you so much. We will leave it here. I'm going to switch off and bid everybody adieu. Have a great night. Thank you all. And
my pleasure.
Please see you again.
Thank you. Thank you all for being there.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks. Good night.